This is a place in where time stands still. In a world of increasing pace, up here there is no sense or evidence of progress, of growth, of the passing of time. Yes, the seasons come and go, but nothing ever changes. At least not on the surface. But it's only when you scratch beneath the surface do you realise that everything is changing, without anyone actually realising it. And despite being a place that time forgot, it is farms like this that are at the forefront of change in British farming. This is what we refer to as our hill farm. It's 3,000 acres of absolute wilderness in what I refer to as the forgotten part of Scotland. I've been coming here ever since I was a kid. We used to come up and help with clipping or with sheep handlings, and some of the coldest days of my childhood were spent on these hills trying to dig sheep out of snowdrifts. And in those 40 years, virtually nothing has changed, at least not on the surface. That shed behind me was constructed in 1994, and apart from the odd fence here or there, it has remained exactly the same. And it's that lack of progress and the isolation here that, for me, give this place its beauty. As I stand here at the cottage, the nearest inhabited house is over 3 miles away at the very bottom of the reservoir down there. The house itself is completely cut off. There's no mains electricity, there's no mains water, there's no mains gas. This is probably about as isolated as you can get in southern Scotland. Believe it or not though, there is actually another house 3 miles up that dirt track, and that house really is beyond isolated. We've always run Blackie sheep on the hill up here, mostly because it's such a harsh environment. There's actually very little else that can survive on land like this. It's also just a blanket of peat, so you can't even grow trees on this, which again adds to that sense of just nothingness. Now we run 1 Blackie out for every 5 acres of land that we've got up here, and if you're lucky enough and you look closely enough, you might actually be able to see a couple. There's one up in the hill up there. So from a food production point of view, it's not very productive at all, but from an environmental standpoint, it's a completely different story. And it is the land use changes in places like this that are the most dramatic, but the most subtle of all. Up until about 10 years ago, nobody actually wanted land like this. When we were in the EU and yield was king, it was a very unappealing proposition to try and make a living out of land like this. We tenanted this land from Buccleuch Estates for around 90 years, and back when the tenancy was signed, there was some very, very favourable agreements to encourage farmers to take on these sort of tenancies and work the land. And back then that was just fine. The lamb that was reared off the land coupled with a wool check was enough to support 3 shepherds on a farm which covered 5,000 acres. But over time, markets and economies change. We now live in a global world in where lamb prices have declined and wool has become, well, virtually worthless. So it makes it very, very difficult to justify farming this land from an economical standpoint. We are, of course, within an LFAS area up here, which is a less favoured area scheme, so we receive subsidies for that. But with all the transition in Scotland, who knows what's going to happen to those subsidies beyond 2025. And just when farms like this all over Scotland were under threat, the world woke up to the climate emergency and the ability of places like this to help. This land is just a blanket of peat. You literally cannot get away from the stuff, as you can probably see behind me. I'm in the lower ground. That there is, well, I'm 6 foot, so that must be probably 2 metres worth of peat, if not more. There's peat hags up in the top of the hills that are over 3 metres deep. And it is this sort of stuff and this kind of landscape that they want farmers to protect, because peat like this is one of the biggest carbon sinks on the entire planet. We have 1,000 acres of Triple SI, which is a special site of scientific interest, which forms part of that field behind me. We call that the useless field because it is so wet and useless when it comes to food production. There is, however, a huge amount of plants and biodiversity in the ground which all offer a massive amount of ecological benefit. More and more now farmers are being encouraged to protect the land and to return it to its natural state, to the way it's always been, to effectively leave it alone. And in untouched areas like this, it's a very easy thing to do. But easy isn't always best, and it is the knock-on effect of these changes that are much more subtle but harder felt. This used to be a bustling little glen and where people worked, where they raised families, and there was a sense of community. But now it feels nothing more like a ghost town. It's like a mini Highland clearances and where people have packed everything up and just abandoned the landscape in search of pastures new. This farm used to employ 3 people, all of whom had families, and the farm across the water used to employ another. And this here is all that remains of the small school that used to teach all the kids that lived up this glen. And of course a community hall before it was turned into a house. And this is all that remains of the houses that used to be here for the reservoir workers before technology took their jobs. And these are the silent consequences of pursuing an environmental strategy. It's the loss of work, the loss of income, it's the loss of these rural communities that really hit people the hardest. Some might argue that that's just progress and that is the price that we have to pay in pursuing an environmental strategy, but for others, it's their livelihood and their way of life that they are losing. We as farmers and landowners have a duty of care, not just to the land, but also to the people who live here. But there's also a business case that needs to be answered, and whatever direction is travelled, be it the environment or food production, it needs to pay. Farms like this have always been on the extreme. Trying to eke out a living in a wilderness like this really isn't for the faint-hearted, but the environmental benefits of land like this has now become evident. But those environmental benefits come at a huge cost to the people who used to call places like this home. Now, I don't have the answer to this, and to be quite frank, I don't think anybody does. But it's important to realise that the decisions made in government offices all over the country have very, very far-reaching consequences. And even in places like this, where it feels as if nothing ever changes, everything changes. And as I've come to realise, nothing ever stands still.